1950s, he was writing books like The Variable Man, which has a great Ed Emshwiller cover. So, by the way, you started getting some wonderful artists as well: Ed Emshwiller and Richard Powers and Kelly Freas, and on and on. John Schoner. Many of them were writing. Were the illustrators were doing book covers and also illustrating magazine covers and interior illustrations. So you get all of these wonderful artists. Wally Wood's another one, doing great work throughout. And Wally Wood actually went between book covers and magazine illustration and comic book illustration with EC Comics, Weird Science, and so forth. But here's another now Philip K. Dick, of course, also wrote Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was made into Blade Runner. So that's one of my favorite movies. We'll get to that when we talk about movies. But Philip K. Dick was incredibly prolific, and part of this was thanks to amphetamines. But one year he wrote 12 novels in 1 year, and also wrote short stories in that year as well. And in fact, he was writing so fast that sometimes he wouldn't remember at the end of a novel what he had set up at the beginning. So The Zap Gun is one of those. And there's extremely variable quality in his work, but his best work is phenomenal. Books like as I said, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and on and on. I mean, you can look up his books, and he's just an amazing writer. Dr. Blood Money is really good. He's interesting even when he's not at his strongest, and always a very interesting writer. The Simulacra is another one. Many of his books have been made into movies, and his short stories. Total Recall, which was based on We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, and also Paycheck, and Rod Serling wanted to adapt Imposter, which is a great story by Philip K. Dick, but it was the rights were wrapped up at the time, so that wasn't made into Twilight Zone episode, sadly. But Philip K. Dick was another one of these writers who had to keep writing at a furious pace. He had wanted to be a mainstream writer, and he'd actually written several novels that were mainstream, but they were all rejected. Later, they would be published, most of them posthumously. But he went into science fiction because that's where he could sell. And actually, I prefer his science fiction writing because he had kind of this strange mind and this very strange view of reality being very permeable. And the three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch is another one of his novels that's very creepy and interesting. And then as the drug culture, as you got into the 60s, then the drug culture entered into things, and you started to get hallucinogens and LSD, and some of the science fiction writers started taking drugs. There was one science fiction convention when most of the writers were on LSD at the time in the late 60s, and so that started entering into their work. And you start to get a divide in the 60s of writers who were right-wing and writers who were left-wing. Now, growing up, I was reading all of these writers with no idea of what their politics were, but there was during the Vietnam War, there was an issue, I think it was of maybe Worlds of If, where there was a 2-page ad of we support the Vietnam War on one side and we oppose the Vietnam War on the other, and there were all the science fiction writers on either side of the debate. And of course, Harlan Ellison and Theodore Sturgeon and those writers were on the left, and Heinlein and Poul Anderson and those writers, mainly the hard science fiction writers, were on the right. And it was very interesting to see, having grown up with all these writers, whose politics were where. And but then I mentioned, here's another writer who came to prominence in the 50s, the great Harlan Ellison. This is one of my favorite Ed Emshwiller covers. We've actually acquired the rights to Ed Emshwiller's designs for Space Command from his son Stoney Emshwiller, and we actually designed a gun based on one of his gun illustrations, and we want to do a lot more. I love Ed Emshwiller's work. He's a phenomenal artist and became a great filmmaker in later years. But this was Harlan Ellison, and this is another one of his things, A Touch of Infinity, not as good a cover, but this is an ace double, and that's where they published 2 novels, really short novels or novellas, together. And but Harlan Ellison was a writer who came to prominence in the 50s and rose to great fame in the 60s and 70s. I did a long memorial to Harlan recently on Mr. Sci-Fi. He was a huge influence on my life and on my work. I mean, all these writers we're talking about were big influences on me. And and the fascinating thing was they were, again, very collegiate in their attitudes. Most of them you could meet at science fiction conventions. They would hang out with you. They would, you could take them to a drink. They weren't snobbish at all. They weren't standoffish. It wasn't like Hollywood where, if you try to approach someone whose work you admire, you'll be tased. These were people who were part of the community, and they appreciated it. And there was a great communication between them and their fans, one that I've continued the tradition of, because I view myself as very much like my fans. And so Harlan was really like an exploding cigar or like a firework. He was very temperamental, very brilliant, very driven, and he wanted to win. He was very competitive. And Harlan and Robert Silverberg were pals in New York, and they both broke into the magazine market at the same time. And Harlan, of course, and Silverberg were writing science fiction, and Harlan was writing stories about the New York gangs because he'd run with a New York gang for research at one point and wrote about that. But mainly his head was in the genre, in the science fiction genre, which he loved from when he broke in his 20s to when he was in his 80s and passed away sadly a few weeks ago. But he would make a huge mark on the 60s, and we'll get to him in a moment. But let's continue talking about the 1950s, because again, this was a seminal era for science fiction, because after World War II and the atom bomb, you started to get this interesting mixture of scientists being held on high and seeing them as the hope for the future, but also the notion of humanity being wiped out by the nuclear bombs. And so we were all under the cloud of that through the 50s into the 60s, and so you started getting dystopic fiction. Most science fiction writers would take a crack at an after the bomb story, and it became a subgenre of science fiction. So you have Lee Brackett writing The Long Tomorrow. You have A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller, which is another great book. And a lot of these writers had been in World War II, and they were kind of processing that experience with after the bomb stories. Very interesting stuff, and also their experience in World War II in the Army Air Corps, etc. That was also filtering into sort of the space-going science fiction they were writing. So a lot of those crews were like World War II crews on destroyers or bombers transplanted to space. And so you would read some of these books and you'd get a strong feeling of that. And I mentioned Robert Heinlein, so let's talk about Heinlein. Heinlein broke into science fiction in 1939. He was he was basically he wanted to be in the war. He'd come up in the military, the Naval Academy, but he was sidelined by breathing ailment and thus couldn't take part. So he became a writer. Writing was his career to make money so that he could survive. But he had a natural knack for it. He was a great science fiction writer, and he could write science fiction that felt very, very real. And he had a scientific mind, and he started writing books. I'll show you some of his early books. These are just terrific. This was an anthology he edited called Tomorrow the Stars. And I love these book covers. And here's The Man Who Sold the Moon, a collection of his short stories. Another great cover. You can see the dame and the guy and the rocket ship and the moon. Cool. And Universe, which he later expanded into a novel called Orphans of the Sky, two-headed mutant. And that's about a generation ship. I talked about that in one of the recent Mr. Sci-Fis. And here's another great story of his, The Puppet Master. Now, Jack Finney had written The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was made into a great movie, but this is The Puppet Masters. They're both about sort of aliens taking over human beings, and they're wonderful books and very fun to read. And both were made into movies and of varying quality. But Heinlein became one of the other four great writers, and he would be interviewed and he would appear on TV shows, less so than Bradbury, less so than Arthur C. Clarke. They were the two ones that you would see all the time on television and newspapers, being interviewed on the radio, wherever. Ray had a great ability to speak to audiences and utilized that to help popularize himself. Now, also another thing these writers were doing that was very, very clever, particularly Ray Bradbury and Heinlein, is they were getting their books into school libraries and into school curriculums. So, for instance, Fahrenheit 451 became part of almost every English class reading curriculum. And by the way, another thing that caused Ray to write Fahrenheit 451 was, and by the way, I might as well show you this. Okay, here we go. This is the paperback cover by Joe Magnani, Ray's great cover artist and interior artist. He drew covers for many of Ray's books, and also did interior illustrations for Fahrenheit 451 and for The October Tree, etc., etc. But Ray was also alarmed not just by blacklisting in America, but by the book burning that the Nazis did. And in fact, at various points, Fahrenheit 451 has been banned, ironically. But Ray and Heinlein got their books. Their publishers also worked to get their books into the school libraries, into the curriculum, particularly Ray with Fahrenheit 451, but also Heinlein was doing something very, very interesting because he was writing short stories and novels aimed at the adult audience, but also something that was emerging in the late 40s and throughout the 50s were books that were called juvenile fiction. Now, these were books, there were juvenile fiction books like nurse books and things like that, and the Bobbsey twins aimed at girls. And there'd also been a tradition of this from the 19th into the 20th century, but it really kicked in the late 40s and early 50s. So sometimes they would be TV tie-ins. Like, for instance, this is a Tom Corbett book written by Kerry Rockwell, and with Willy Ley, the famous rocket scientist, as an advisor. But this was, Stand By for Mars, a Tom Corbett book, and there were a series of these. And some science fiction writers who were writing adult fiction were writing juvenile fiction under pseudonyms. So, for instance, you might get Lucky Star and the Moons of Jupiter, which is part of the series. And this was published ostensibly by Paul French. I love the dog in the spacesuit there. But Lucky Star was actually the pseudonym. And by the way, this is a review copy, first edition. But you can see it's Doubleday and Company Incorporated. Please observe publication date and send 2 clippings of any notice of this book to Publicity Department, Doubleday and Company Incorporated, 575 Madison Avenue, New York, 22, New York. And then with the phone number Murray Hill 85300. And so it's fun because this is actually a review copy that was sent out to the book reviewers. But these were published intended for a teenage audience or kids, and apparently, the writers were not thrilled to be writing them. It was for a buck, essentially, and they might be fun to read, but Isaac Asimov didn't want people to know that he was Paul French. And then here's another one of these juvenile science fiction novels, Battle on Mercury by Erik Van Linn, and that is actually Lester Del Rey. And I suspect that Erik Van Linn is probably, some reworking of the letters of his name. But again, I haven't done that. But you can see they have lurid and very fun covers, But these writers didn't want, Lester Del Rey and Isaac Asimov and the others who were writing pseudonymously, as was Harlan Ellison, as was Robert Silverberg, writing all sorts of stuff under pseudonyms, for all these different magazines. They didn't want it known that they were slumming in juveniles, with one exception, which was in 1948, Robert Heinlein wrote Rocket Ship Galileo. And you can see it's his name on the book, Robert A. Heinlein. And by the way, it's Robert Anson Heinlein, and there's a character named Anson Kemmer, who's the hero's father in Space Command, and I've named him after Heinlein. But Heinlein would write an adult science fiction novel pretty much once a year, and a juvenile once a year through the 50s. And so while he was writing adult books, he was also writing juveniles, and they're wonderful. And you can see some of them behind me. There's Starman Jones and Red Planet, and behind me on this side is Have Spacesuit Will Travel and Citizen of the Galaxy and Space Cadet, Farmer in the Sky. These books, these juvenile books, were in libraries, elementary school libraries and high school libraries. Now, I love, by the way, now sadly, a lot of these books have been decommissioned and they're no longer in libraries. So when I go on eBay, this is a first edition of Space Cadet, another Robert Heinlein book, and interestingly enough, and so I love these books because you can see when they were checked out. Library books have a history. I love when people write their names in their books. This was given as a gift to somebody in 1922 or whatever. So you can see that people check this out in years gone by, and who they were and what their names were. It's just really fun. And these covers are wonderful, and they also have interior illustrations often, which are equally, fun, and so they really sum it up. And Heinlein was putting a lot of his heart and soul into these books. He wasn't slumming. He wasn't speaking down to his audience. They're wonderful to read. They really hold up. I love Have Spacesuit Will Travel. It's a great book, a great cover by Ed M. Schwiller again. And interestingly enough, Space Cadet, there was another writer of juvenile fiction who essentially came up with the idea for Tom Corbett's Space Cadet, but then to kind of get a little bigger visibility on it, they acquired Space Cadet from Heinlein, so because he had just come out with Destination Moon, which was a big A-list feature, and on the heels of that, they thought, well, we can acquire this book, Tom Corbett Space Cadet, call our show, or it's basically Space Cadet. It doesn't have Tom Corbett in it, but we can take this title, call our show Tom Corbett Space Cadet, and we can have Heinlein's fame kind of be attached to our project. Ironically, Space Cadet started as just a name he came up with as a, non-pejorative term, but then throughout the 50s it started to become, someone would be called a space cadet who was kind of out to lunch. And Heinlein actually in Have Spacesuit Will Travel, which was written later in the 50s, actually has this kind of bully idiot guy taunting our hero, our teenage hero, by calling him a space cadet. And then of course our hero becomes a hero in space. And so it's very, very fun in that way. But Heinlein was a very right-wing writer, and he basically pulls his politics back a bit in the juveniles and writes them a little more front and center in his adult novels. So I actually prefer his juveniles for the most part. They're fun. They're imaginative. Tunnel in the Sky, The Star Beast. You can buy them on eBay or Amazon. They're still in print, and they're just great fun to read for the most part. I recommend them, but here's something interesting that happened. So Heinlein's writing about one of these a year, and it's going along fine, and they all have teenage main characters, and they're all about various adventures in space and so forth, and wonderful illustrations, and they're selling very well. And he's also writing his adult fiction, The Puppet Masters, and on and on. And then he came up with one called Starship Troopers, and his publisher had serious concerns because this has our teenage hero killing people. And they rejected it, and Heinlein was very miffed. He basically was working on two juveniles that he intended to publish as juvenile books, and the first was Starship Troopers, and the second was called Podkayne of Mars. Those were going to be his, two more of his juveniles, but because Starship Troopers was rejected, he said, no, I'm done with that. So he published Starship Troopers as an adult novel, and this came out in, let's see, this is the first edition of this. It came out in 1959, and won the Hugo Award. Won the top award in science fiction. So that rejection proved to be a wonderful thing for Heinlein. And again, this is a deactivated library edition, so you can see, who checked it out and when. And so, for instance, Mike Zambito checked it out in the 60s, in 1961, as did John Brooks and Joe Powderly, and in 1962, Jim O'Donnell checked it out, on and on. But again, a well-loved and a well-used book, and again, an evocative. The book covers. I love the book covers in science fiction. The hardcovers are a little more oblique. The paperbacks are a little more lurid. For instance, like the Fahrenheit 451 cover is in color. It's Joe Manganiello in color, whereas the hardcover is in black and white. But it's okay. So Heinlein writes Starship Troopers, wins the Hugo. Then he comes out with Podkayne of Mars, again another. Essentially another teenage heroine in this case, and he had an ending that was fairly dark, and so his publisher objected. So the original first edition, this is the first edition, didn't have that original ending. Heinlein had to soften it, but the new editions actually have his original ending. And again, that's there's the man. That's what he looked like. You can see kind of studio. He was very handsome as a young man. In fact, if you look at the Space Command pilot on Mr. Sci-Fi, the first half hour which we posted, there's a scene where we pan the family photos of Jack Kemmer in his parents' house, and there's a young man in a Naval Academy uniform, and that's actually Heinlein as a teenager, a little tip of the hat. So then we moved into the 60s, and that's where you start getting some new voices, some young Turks essentially writing, and I'll talk more about those in another installment, but I just want to show two books that were very instrumental in influencing people. And again, if you look behind me at my bookshelves, you can see many of the other books of the 50s and 60s. Again, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so I was reading used books of stories that were written in the 50s and 60s. And you can see many of them behind me. There's City by Clifford D. Simak, another wonderful writer, another wonderful book, a great cover. But you can just see what was activating my imagination. And as we moved through from the 50s into the 60s and on, science fiction started becoming mainstream. Science fiction books, science fiction writers, science fiction movies and TV shows. In the 50s, we had science fiction television shows. I'll talk about those in the TV section of this history of science fiction. But I want to show one book that we'll be talking about more in the next installment of Mr. Sci-Fi's History of Science Fiction. This is Dangerous Visions. It is an anthology by Harlan Ellison, and it won the Hugo, and it was enormously influential. And then and that's of course the first edition, and here is Logan's Run. by William F. Nolan and George Clayton Johnson. I'll talk about that in more detail in the next installment as well. But this was published by a non-science fiction publisher, and it was written to sell to the movies. So it had a very direct goal, and it succeeded in that goal. And we'll talk about the writers who came up with these kind of books and Dangerous Visions, which changed science fiction forever. And so that's it for now. There's much more to come, and I'm glad to have you along on this journey, Mr. Sci-Fi's history of science fiction. If you haven't subscribed to Mr. Sci-Fi, I strongly recommend that you do. If you want to find out about Space Command, we've got lots posted here on Space Command. You can buy shares for $7,500 in Space Command, which we're pitching as a series. I strongly recommend you invest in Space Command. I think it will do wonderful things coming over the next few months. And additionally, I'm on Facebook, Mr. Sci-Fi, Marc Zicree, and on Twitter, @Marc Zicree, and there's lots of fun ahead. So thanks very much. Many more adventures to come, and we'll talk to you real soon. Bye, guys.